an ideal world, maybe we could even somehow figure out a way to, you could sit outside in the sun and look inside somehow and see the projection, but unfortunately not. I guess this is just up there in case you want to log into the Wi-Fi network, so obviously take advantage of that. You can send some emails, apply for jobs, do whatever you need to do here during the proceedings, and so on. So we're going to kick off the afternoon session. There's going to be a session, or a sequence of 3 speakers, and then we're going to do kind of an open Q&A with them. And starting off is going to be novelist Ian MacLeod. And Ian is the most recent recipient of the Arthur C. Clarke Award in 2009. This is for his novel, The Song of Time. And he's got 2 other books that I find that were the way that I first encountered Ian's work, which was The Light Ages and House of Storms, which kind of reimagine it's sort of an alternative England where the industrial age is fueled by ether instead of fossil fuels. And there are a whole bunch of interesting spatial, cultural, and sort of quasi-magical implications of this sort of fuel shift. So yeah, we'll see what Ian's going to talk to us about today, and then after that, followed up with a Q&A and the next speakers. So cool. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you. Right, well, I'm not here as an architect. I'm here as a writer. Last time I stood in front of one of these things was actually to make my acceptance speech for the Arthur C. Clarke Award, which the Guardian called charmingly shambolic. So I'm not sure whether that's good or bad, probably a mixture of both. Anyway, I'm here as a writer. My most recent book is up there on the screen, and I'm going to keep the graphics to an absolute minimum. In fact, you're probably seeing them at their full extent as we speak. And I'm going to talk about the difficulty of writing about the future. Not only for myself, but for anyone who wants to write about the future. And one of the things that I'm going to look at a bit is I work with kids in schools, and I'll be, rather than reading out some of my own work, I'll be reading out some of their stuff to give you an idea of how they now address some of the issues to do with imagining what's going to happen in their lives. As for my own life, just to give you a bit of background as to why I became a writer, I guess. I grew up in a council estate in a very non-futuristic part of Birmingham, and in a very non-literary background. We had about 3 or 4 books in my parents' house when I grew up, and they were all up by the budgie seed in the kitchen. And one of them was a novel by a forgotten writer called Geoffrey Farnell, missing the final chapter. There was a dictionary missing the letters A and Z. There was How to Pass Your Driving Test in 7 Weeks, and there was a copy of the Kama Sutra. And any of you who have read or are aware of my work, you may detect influences from all of those books spilling through in a whole variety of ways. What made me want to write SF is reading this stuff. Asimov, Clarke, John Wyndham, all that sort of stuff really was what introduced me to adult literature. And I wasn't a kid who grew up I didn't go to grammar school. I didn't come from an academic background, as you probably gathered. And they were really the books that taught me how to read and what fiction was about. When I did start to look at more, dare I say it, proper literature, it was when I moved on to study A-levels at a grammar school, and I was introduced to writers like T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, and so on and so forth, John Donne, whatever, and I found that I loved those as much as I loved Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and all the other kinds of writers that we've been seeing on these marvellous projections of thrilling wonder stories. And at the time that I was doing this was a very exciting time in SF. We're talking about the late 60s. It was an exciting time in most areas of the arts, but you're looking at the writer whose name keeps cropping up here, J G Ballard in Britain. We're looking at Michael Moorcock, some of his more experimental stuff, the whole New Worlds thing that was going on in British SF. And we're also looking at American writers like Harlan Ellison, Roger Zelazny, who really, Samuel R. Delany, who are really saying, hey, we can do whatever the hell we like with science fiction, because that's the whole point of the genre. And we can take risks, and we can do, yes, we can have speculation and premise, but we can do whatever we want with it. So I was reading this stuff, and I was thinking, hey, this is cool. This is the future of literature. I thought. And I want to be a writer, and I want to be part of that future. So I guess, in a way, one of the futures I'll be talking about is the future of fiction, in a sense. At the time, the future, though, in the sense of the imagined years ahead, was a very different thing. And in particular, it was cool. Okay, probably one of the major spectres was nuclear holocaust, which everyone seems to have forgotten about now. Perhaps we've rather turned our back on that one. But to me, even that was cool, because afterwards you get these sort of, these sort of shape-changing chameleon-type creatures who have been changed by in this wasteland, who have been changed by the radiation. And of course I'd survive. A lot of other people wouldn't, sorry about the rest of you, but it would be good, and we'd have fun in this future. These cosy catastrophes, which very often took place where England went back to the Middle Ages and we all started riding around on horses or horseoids or whatever, far-flung planets, huge metropolises, all the things that we associate with science fiction were things that I believed in and wanted to write about and wanted to share. And the dream of the future to me was really a dream of writing about the future and a dream of not experiencing it so much, but of carrying on that as something that was very important to me. Then there was a movie like 2001, which I think for me is still very much a high point, in that it manages to be both scientifically persuasive and visionary. And of course it was an enormous and continuing technological achievement. It's one of the few movies that still works and holds together. From there, from a literary point of view of fiction, I really could go on about how things went downhill for science fiction and how this future started to shrivel. I could go on about, well, there's 2001, but no, the public bought into Star Wars, Star Trek, all fine, all entertaining, but all of us who really cared about SF were thinking, hey, this isn't right. This isn't the way it was going. Science fiction should be more than that. It's not just jumped-up medieval romances with made-up names. It's more than that. It's more profound, it's more exciting, it's cooler, and it's more dangerous. But I do think, to a large extent, the publishing market has taken a particular vision of science fiction and taken it forward. But for me, as a writer, I think the problem about writing about the future is more fundamental. And I don't even think necessarily it's because we don't care about the future because it's not here, because of course it is. It's arrived. It's all around us with the internet and satellite communications and string theory and everything else. But the real reason that we have a problem with the future now is because the future is essentially a myth, and I don't think that people buy into it anymore in the way that they used to. Now, as I say, I do work at schools, and I get the kids who are like 12, 14, 10, I get them to write about what life is going to be like in 100 years' time. When I started doing this with them, I used to say, now kids, I know all about the monorails and the rocket ships and the space travel and the robots, but do remember, I could be a teacher and we could be sitting here in the middle of the Roman Empire, and I'll be saying, imagine 200-300 years ahead, how marvellous it's going to be. And it all went downhill. And the kids would nod. But I stopped doing that after a while because I realised the kids needed no prompting at all from me to think in terms of dark and catastrophic futures. In fact, I find myself now pushing the silver spandex suits and the jetpacks very, very hard because I'd love to see them in some of their writing, and they hardly ever appear. The modern child is surrounded by news about the future, which is very, very different to the kind of news that I was experiencing as a kid in the 1960s. And I'll give you a few examples. The room stank of last night's pasteurised steak and chips with a hint of disgusting grass seed juice. I'm just glad I'm unable to taste that unimaginable filth going down my throat. I'm just lucky that I don't have a throat. My room hasn't changed in 31 years, and I'm glad of it. Or, every day I wake up to the same thing. I clamber out of bed and reach for my walking stick and make my way over to the window. I look outside and I'm surrounded by shiny buildings, high as the sky, covered in huge posters advertising new inventions. The thick smog consumes the huge city. Everything is dark and grey. Clouds of smoke rush from the chimneys of the factories, circling the other buildings. Or, somewhat more futuristically, Nowadays, nobody in the community speaks to each other. You don't even know your next door neighbour's name. Why should you? Nobody walks anywhere anymore. Everyone drives or flies, depending on your kind of car. This may sound exciting, but it just means traffic jams are on more than one level. Yes, as I was saying, nobody walks places, everyone can drive. Driving isn't exactly hard. You put in your destination, choose your route, and your car takes you there. No driving tests needed now. This is still public transport, of course, for the people not able to afford a car or who simply cannot handle the new technology, like old fogies like me. And these are children writing, as I say, with me, prompting them about all the wondrous visions of the future, writing about old age, loneliness, pollution, despair in big metropolises. The metropolises are still there. I guess they live in them now. But it's not the future that I would have written about, and I think that it shows just how much has changed about this myth of the future from the time that I bought into it as a kid. I think one of the things is that the kids the idea of progression, even if it was progression towards the whole of Birmingham being changed into a shining crater of vulcanized glass or whatever, at least it was a progression, at least it was change. I think in a way what's happened with the new generation is that they are seeing the future in the way that probably people throughout most of history have actually seen it. I don't think that your average medieval peasant or Roman slave or whatever probably really saw the future at all. All they saw was a continuation. Yes, they were worried about things getting worse. Yes, they hoped that they would get better. But they didn't see the future as a thing about going forward. They saw it as a variety of means of going sideways. And they didn't feel the excitement that we briefly felt, and that I certainly shared in, about the monorails. Have I said monorails a few times? I probably have. I may mention them again. Or even, again, nuclear war. So what's happened? How did we get there? How is it that the future doesn't feel right when we're in it, doesn't feel as cool as it was, and that we don't buy into the concept in the way that we used to? It's not, as I say, I think, really because the future's let us down, although it obviously has, but more because of a cultural drift away from the future. Now, again, looking at these things from the point of view of fiction, most of the great works of fantastic fiction of earlier eras tended not to be set in this thing called the future. If you think of Frankenstein, Gulliver's Travels, the Iliad, Jules Verne, even a lot of H.G. Wells' stuff, it tended to be set in some sort of changed or never-ending now. The future was not the main premise throughout most of time, although, of course, every era and every society has its own type of fantastic and mythological literature. That changed with the golden age of SF, which I think you can trace back to the same time that we're looking at these magazines, to the 1930s and 40s, magazines like Amazing and Fantastic Tales and so on and so forth, and the dream that these magazines were buying into. And if you think of the 30s and 40s in Europe and America, we're looking at the Nazis, who were big futurologists. Look at their buildings, look how they believed in clean living, good health, fresh air, eugenics, all these marvellous things, as they seemed to them then, were all part of the future vision. And then, of course, we look at World War II, and I always think with these sort of pulp magazines, I imagine GI and British soldiers reading them on their bunk beds, or as they prepared to go into battle, and dreaming of the time when the war ended and they'd return home to a paradise of TVs, fridges, cheap cars, jet aeroplanes, rockets, and everything else that would change their lives. It was a dream that was certainly being sold to people at that time. It certainly suited the Nazis, it certainly suited the European allies to tell people that the world was going to get immeasurably more wonderful and immeasurably better. And of course, at the same time that this was going on, the future's darker side was also enacting itself. There was the atom bomb, there was Auschwitz, psychological warfare, carpet bombing, and the population explosion are all products of the same era. So you can see why science fiction in the 40s, 50s, and 60s would really be buzzing, because it was trying to keep these so many different balls in the air, contradictory balls, paradise or hell, what was the future going to bring? But it was a future. It was a big, big thing that was people dreamed about and thought about and believed in as some kind of myth. And as I say, I think that from about the time probably that I started writing SF, in a sense, although I don't hold myself personally responsible, in a sense I think that things have started to dissolve from that. I mean, if you look at the film that Kubrick made after 2001, it was of course A Clockwork Orange, which is a dystopian, well, a brilliant work, a dystopian fiction. Of course the Apollo program ended, the space shuttle has turned out to be something of an expensive mess, and nothing really has taken up the visionary slack that was left by these things. The communists have come to seem more and more like us. We still haven't got those messages from space. Still no cure for the common cold, let alone world poverty. All the diseases we thought we got rid of are coming back. The tall futuristic buildings turned out a lot more fun to blow up than to live in. The motorways have become a joke. And then, to top it all, men dressed in medieval clothes and talking like something out of a way-out fantasy start using what we thought was our technology in an attempt to humiliate and destroy us. So, all in all, I think the future's taken a bit of a dive. And I think perhaps most crucially of all, especially for those of us who live in little old Britain, big old America is not the big old America that it was and is no longer the world superpower on its own, which stands unassailable and unchallenged. And so much of what science fiction is about the American dream. So, SF is a concept, and the concept of the future obviously resides very big in that. And it was briefly, I say, the major myth, or one of the major myths of our society, if I can say society, our society. And when I say our society, I think I do have to mean primarily Western society, and when I say literature and art, I do mean primarily Western literature and art. So are the myths that are replacing this myth? Looking in terms of fiction, of course, before SF we had the Western. Again, another projection of the American dream. Again, another thing about unbounded possibilities, risk, danger, far open spaces and things to be discovered. There's the myth of the logical murder, which is increasingly popular at the moment, I guess because people love the idea that you can make sense of acts of violence. In the Victorian times, of course, if you think what the Victorians wrote about, they rather liked to read about themselves, and who can blame them? And then, of course, there's the medieval myths, which were, I guess you could point back towards Walter Scott, and which Tolkien took hold of and turned into a massive industry, which really seems to satisfy the needs of a large number of people in the sense that it allows them to escape into a fantasy, which certainly isn't a fantasy or a myth of the future world. And then, of course, there's the myth of the horror novel, which Stephen King is obviously one of the greatest proponents of. That myth, I guess, being that beneath this rather nice and tidy veneer of civilization, strange, dark and terrible things lurk, which will grab us as soon as we leave this room. Maybe that's a myth, maybe it's not. Sometimes I think when you think of horror fiction, it's not so much an extrapolation of what is happening as a description of it. So there are other genres which have moved in to take over some of the area that SF once used to occupy in terms of portraying society and the world as it is. And the basic SF need, I think, which used to be for a logical exposition, for things to make some kind of sense, is perhaps something that we no longer feel that we have the desire for that we used to. But for all that, we still want to dream, we still want to find new ways of saying things about our dreams, and we still want to deal with what's going to happen to our lives and the lives of our friends and the lives of our children. So, I'm going to propose to you MacLeod's 8 problems on the difficulty of writing with SF Future. Until about yesterday afternoon, actually, it was MacLeod's 7 problems, but I thought of another one in the meantime, and I tossed them to you to disagree with or agree with or debate. First of all, the future probably isn't going to be dominated by Western culture, which in itself founded the myth of the future. Secondly, people won't be people as we know them now. Machine intelligence and genetic engineering are things which are developing at a very rapid pace. Thirdly, space travel is unlikely to happen in any way remotely like the way that we once imagined it would, and as we witnessed in the Apollo programs, and of course faster than light travel remains impossible. Fourthly, science itself is becoming increasingly incomprehensible. The world of Newtonian physics and even Darwinian evolution is continually being undermined by new discoveries, and even something like quantum theory now really almost seems like quite old-fashioned and homely, like sort of mum's cooking, although we all struggle to understand that. So the actual world itself is beyond our comprehension. And maybe one of the myths that science used to buy into is the idea that we, of all the species that we know of in the universe, are capable of understanding the world. My dog can't understand the world, don't expect it to. Why should I expect me to? There's a human arrogance there, which I think is being slowly dissolved as we find out more, or what little we can, about the way the universe really works. Fifthly, real aliens, if they did exist, would probably be so incomprehensible to us that they would barely be recognizable as alive. And if that's not the case, if they really were going boldly forth across the universe, they would be here already. Sixthly, the physics and technology which you'd need to drive a more advanced society than ours would make as little sense to us as the modern world would make to a caveman. Seventhly, the language and means of expression will be completely different, and communication as a whole will probably no longer take place in the way that I'm talking to you now. And finally, and eighthly, there's a very strong likelihood that we're all going to be dead. So, I give you a Song of Time, which is my attempt to deal with the next 100 years, the near future, and in a believable way. And I do deal with the problems of climate change, global catastrophe, terrorism, and so forth. And I also, in particular, deal with, I think, with what is one of the biggest, most exciting challenges, both in reality but also for writers of science fiction, which is the leap into machine intelligence. And indeed, the main character in the book is an old lady looking back on this century, and what she is contemplating as her mind is recorded by an implant is whether she makes that recording take over and be moved into some kind of data bank. And if she were to do that, if all the thoughts and impressions that have been recorded from her were moved, would it be her that would be moving? Would it be her soul? Or would it simply be just another clever computer program? So that's what Song of Time is about. And in a way, it's very much an attempt to deal optimistically with what I think is potentially an extremely difficult and interesting century that mankind has ahead of us. And to finish off, I'm going to give you a couple more readings from the kids I've worked with. And these are a little bit different, I think. First of all, on the subject of machine intelligence, I've been reduced down to nothing more than a head, wired up to a mainframe of artificial intelligence. I have no sense of taste, touch, smell. I can see, hear, nothing more. However, I am alive. And I can fight for the remaining humans left before they become extinct by these Marinians. Now is the time to activate the defense systems. I am in charge and we will win this war once and for all. So, let's hope there's some Marinians out there that still need fighting. And the final extract from one of my students' writing is perhaps, I think, a little bit more like the future really will be, which is it's going to be mundane and it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be surprising and it's going to be disappointing, which I guess in our heart of hearts we all have always known is what the future is actually going to be like. The streets are full with people wandering and rushing on their ways, in and out of every building, hastily going about their everyday business. The sky is just as hectic, occupied by cars and vehicles. If I gaze up, everything is a blur, all the vehicles whizzing past. The only evidence that they were once there is a line of smoke left behind as a trail of their journey. If sometime during the day you take the chance to peer up toward the stars, you'll see the most picturesque sight. The stars watch above us, sparkling beautifully in the sky, the planets glowing in a rainbow of colours, the mysteries of the universe gazing down on me and the old world. That's where I once lived, but it's better where I am now. However, I'm still close. The moon isn't that far away. And so I guess, at the end of the day, the universe is a wonderful place, and it's still out there. And maybe, and in one day, and in ways perhaps we can scarcely imagine, we will even get back to the moon, which is never that far away. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Ian. I think we're actually going to just continue transitioning through the speakers and then do a summary Q&A with everyone afterward. Okay. But you end on a perfect note, I think, for the next speaker, the idea of the dystopian optimism, the future, and especially you mentioned the phrase the near future. And I think that this is going to be at least part of what Nick talks about in his talk. But before I introduce Nick, let's just give another round of applause for Ian.
Thank you.
And definitely check out his new book. And again, as questions develop, just hold on to them, and we're going to be doing a Q&A with these three speakers. So up next is Nick Clear, and Nick is a professor over at the Bartlett School of Architecture, the other school that shall not be named, and is also the editor of the forthcoming issue of AD, which I believe actually should be, out in, 2-3 weeks, or Nick?
No, it's in September.
In September. So that comes out in September, and the theme of that is the near future, so it's kind of an architectural look at everything from science fiction to Ballard to just the whole idea of the near future, and how can architects project through their spatial imagination what may or may not come next. So as Nick sets up his computer, we'll segue into that discussion.
I'm not sure if this is actually going to be the cover of the Architectures of the Near Future, but it's going to be something like this. What I'm going to talk about deals with a lot of the same kind of issues that are being addressed already today. I'm specifically going to be picking up one of the themes that Jeff mentioned, and it's about the people who we refer to within schools of architecture. And I put this proposal together for Architectures of the Near Future as a homage to J G Ballard. In fact, I wanted it to be much more explicitly about Ballard, because I thought that he was the most important and prescient writer on the contemporary city. And every time I kind of used to say this in schools of architecture, people would be kind of extremely dismissive, because after all, he's only a writer. But through the way in which he imagines the kind of banalities of everyday life, and the way in which even kind of huge effects kind of come down to the way in which we engage with each other at a kind of mundane level, I still think he is one of the, if not the most important writer on architecture and architectural ideas of the late 20th, early 21st century. I know I can think of very few people who can kind of compare with him. The other thing is, of course, a lot of his work includes as their main characters either architects or buildings themselves. And again, this was a sort of something that I thought was an incredibly significant thing to pick up on. However, the people at architectural design had other ideas. And they said, well, can't you make it a bit more kind of widespread? So, being a complete spineless coward and needing research points, it's very important for us academics, you know. I acquiesced and did open it up. But there is a very, very kind of strong Ballardian thread. And what I'm going to do with over the next kind of half an hour is, for the first 15 minutes, I'm just going to give a kind of overview of what the kind of edition's about. I'm going to show some of the images of people that have contributed to the issue. I'm not going to speak directly about the images, because then you wouldn't go out and buy it. Well, you might not anyway, but... So I'm just going to show the kind of images. And then a lot of the kind of work in the magazine is based on students of mine from the Bartlett. And my unit at the Bartlett uses film, animation and motion graphics to kind of explore spatial and architectural ideas. So I'm going to actually show two of the films where of projects that are featured in the magazine, but which unfortunately, because it's kind of old-fashioned print medium, aren't actually sort of demonstrated. Now, my other big influence is the American theorist of postmodernism, Frederick Jameson. And I like to think that the issue is based somewhere in between these two quotes. That covers a lot of ground, and that's the sort of... This was one of the things that I initially sent off to AD, as this was the kind of area that I wanted to sort of cover. One thing is that architectural design, if you think about it, is always about the near future. Whenever we make a proposition, we always assume that it's going to happen in the near future. We always assume that that future will be better than the present, often as a consequence of what we're proposing. And so architecture, by its very nature, is utopian. But contemporary architecture, unlike earlier models of utopian architecture, or perhaps because of the stigma attached to those models, has resisted an explicitly social and political agenda. Contemporary architecture has become driven by idealist, formalist models, facilitated by the shape-making potentials of the new computer-based design tools, and largely funded by speculative finance. However, one of the most important transformations that has occurred in architecture over the last 30 years has not been the shift in fashions, marking out new typologies, new forms of representation, new materials, or new forms of manufacture. The biggest single shift in architecture has been the new economic relationships within the building industry and the new forms of contractual relationships that this has brought about. The rise of fast-track construction in the 1980s heralded a major change in the motivations for construction and has brought about a homogenisation of building output, largely predicated on maximising the economic value of the project, often with very little regard to the social value of the project. For a number of years, the single model that has shaped the type of future that the architectural profession has based its assumptions on is one of unfettered consumer expansion. The majority of recent architectural debates have not tried to call into question the economic imperatives of late capitalism that drive financial speculation and generate the context within which private development is presented as the only option. Even the architectural avant-garde of the late 1980s are now operating as large international commercial practices, and the generation of deconstructivists has proved enthusiastic capitalists. The critical and intellectual ambitions inspired by Derrida, Deleuze and Debord have been replaced by the monetarist ideologies of Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan. The architectural profession has embraced the late capitalist model enthusiastically and uncritically. The fact that this model has been funded through speculative investment, and now that the money has run out, so have the alternatives. The promise of an urban renaissance has left buildings empty, and negative equity is becoming once again the dominant economic value across the property world. The architecture world has proved incapable of suggesting what the future may hold. Can one still believe in the shiny renders of the corporate architectural complex when it has replaced a vision of the future with an image of the future? But the profession is resourceful. And it's quite clear that the majority of architects are now moving on to play the sustainability game, whether they are designing sustainable airports, sustainable shopping centres, sustainable luxury hotels, sustainable office blocks, sustainable cities in the middle of a desert, or sustainable sustainable single private dwellings for the ultra-rich. We will no doubt start to see a gritty new realism creeping into architectural discourse that responds to these new economic conditions. Indeed, one can imagine such texts already emanating from Boston or from Rotterdam. Exactly how these new imperatives will drive the formal shape-making methodologies that have filled so many glossy pages for so long, we shall see. And how will the interactive and responsive landscapes interact and respond to bankruptcy, increasing unemployment, and a general sense of despair? Contemporary culture has put its faith in an ideology of progress. Progress will make things better, as well as making things faster and smaller, or bigger and slower, depending on the value system. This faith in progress and betterment fails to ring true in the light of economic downturn, environmental catastrophe, increased level of crimes, the threats of terrorism and global pandemics. If the future cannot be guaranteed, where does that leave architecture? This loss of faith is perhaps only a problem if that faith exists in the first place. Within literature, as we've already heard, there's a major strand that looks at the future in a completely different way. Science fiction, according to Jameson, can also be seen as a utopian genre, and in the writings ranging from Jules Verne and H.G. Wells through Aldous Huxley, George Orwell, and more latterly Philip K. Dick, J G Ballard, Neil Stephenson and William Gibson, the future is depicted in a variety of different hues, not all of them as rosy as the futures promised by the architectural profession, and as a result, such speculations are often more believable. While these writings appear to reflect on the future more often than not, they are actually concerned with issues contemporaneous to their production. To cite two obvious examples, Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984 are political and social reflections on the societies around them. And in Huxley's case, it's not at all clear whether he's completely critical of the world that he describes. But it is with Ballard that I'm particularly interested. Ballard's ideas filter through a number of kind of architectural propositions that have been generated both in the unit that I run at the Bartlett and also in the magazine that I've been putting together. They're either explicit or they're kind of there, lingering in the background. Ballard is of special significance largely due to the fact that in so much of his writing, architecture and architects play such a pivotal role. The prescience of Ballard's writing is obvious. His early works encompass environmental disaster, both drought and flooding. In the 70s, novels such as Crash and High Rise dealt with technological fetishization, urban anomie and alienation. And long before such issues hit the mainstream, he looked at the links between consumerism and social collapse. In his recent writings, Millennium People and Kingdom Come, Ballard depicts a Britain bereft of social values other than those of daytime TV and the shopping centre. And while some of his central characters may lack a certain level of credibility, the main character of Kingdom Come is certainly not a 40-year-old advertising executive. His general descriptions of the cultural landscape is far more accurate than almost anything that has been published in any of the recent pages of architectural publications. The future as presented by Ballard is often stark, bleak and uncompromising. There are few happy endings in Ballard's future. However, his collective faith in our ability to endure almost any hardship, drawn almost certainly from his experiences in Shanghai during the Second World War, leads us to believe, despite whatever is thrown at us, we will adapt and we will survive. But like Ballard, let's not despair. Though the future may be uncertain, uncertainty is not without its attractions. The current economic situation offers a great potential for developing a new agenda in architecture, The fact that the discipline of architecture has become synonymous with the architectural profession is something that will no doubt become contested as unemployment rises throughout the building industry. For those of us who can remember previous recessions, we can also remember them as highly creative periods. This will bring to life the obvious gulf between expectation and reality that permeates architectural practice. Architecture is a wonderful discourse, a wonderful training. However, it can be a very, very tedious job. Of course, it does not have to be like this. Freed from the limitations of the profession, architectural projects can offer fantastic opportunity to develop narratives, to help us understand why we are doing the things we do. The fact that architects may have to redefine their operations is potentially a wonderful opportunity to recalibrate and reconsider who and what architecture is actually for. In particular, these uncertain times may be a blessing for a younger generation of architects equipped with a vast array of technical skills and understanding. They are almost certain to cope with the vagaries of future practice, as the skills demonstrated in many of the projects that are on show here. That's not a young architect, by the way. That's actually Ben Nicholson's hand drawings for The World Who Wants It. The last few years have witnessed a gradual, as the skills demonstrated in many of the projects collected here, future architects may be just as adept at web design, graphics and filmmaking, and game design, as they are producing information for buildings. The last few years have witnessed a gradual disenchantment within architectural education towards the goals espoused by the architectural profession. Increased levels of student debt, coupled with a creeping homogenisation of architectural practice, have resulted in a darker turn of student projects. Rather than shrinking away from the potential difficulties, a younger generation of architects have used information technologies to create new sites of architectural endeavour and a whole new meaning to the term architectural design. I forgot to change pictures as I was going through. So I'm going to show a couple of films. These are both projects that are collected in, represented in image form in the magazine. And they kind of represent a quite an amazing level of accomplishment, but also I think they're interested in the way in which they set up potential kind of architectural scenarios. The first film is by a student called Dan Farmer. These are both from my unit from last year. And Dan Farmer, just before he started his 5th year, went blind in one eye. He contracted a condition called optical neuritis, which is a breakdown from the eye to the brain through the optic nerve. And he became interested in why that failure came about, and also the way in which the brain or the body starts repairing those links through a process called cortical plasticity. So other parts of the nervous system start taking on the roles that the kind of damaged nerves have taken on. And through his kind of research, he became interested in ideas of consciousness and perception and the way in which we understand space and represent space. And then he kind of made this film that kind of deals with that. But also kind of deals with the way in which we, using kind of contemporary models of post-production, we simulate and create a sense of three-dimensional space. Sorry, it's the way of the screen. We simulate kind of ideas of three-dimensional space.
Life is not systematic. Any world can be perceived, can enter the mind. Senses are malleable. We underestimate the plasticity of the brain, thinking of it rather as a stationary organ, with perhaps little spurts of plasticity. Life provides infinite synthetic spaces, spaces that become windows or peepholes to the intricacy of nature. This is a metamorphosis, a transition into an alternative state of mind, chosen within the brain's cortical order, independent of our external worlds. My visual cortex has picked up in acuity. It is controlled locally. Visual space will now be my own construction. This world can be truly inhabited, constructed between my personal fact and fable. This is a world that relies on the properties of representation and the rules that govern our internal dynamics. It is not founded on the relationships that exist between organisms and their environments. One must accept that all sensory stimuli enters the brain in the same. It's a stream of electrical pulses created by neuronal activity. Scientifically, there is little to distinguish the colour red from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Once we are able to choose which neurons are stimulated, diverting them from well-worn neural paths, we can dictate the nature of our surroundings. This world, this distillation of senses, this purity of creation. There are no markers of size and distance. These must be constantly relearned and updated on the basis of experience. Experience beyond rationale, an experience of pure vision. One must construct a spatial field of objects, starting from basic principles, without the hindrance of previous experience. Gestures, even the internal sounds of the mind working, become vital signifiers. The body, in turn, acts as a semionaut, recording edges, gradients, and frequencies. Nerves, as the devices of perception, are not interested in light. Nerves only care for geometry. They are stimulated by borders, boundaries, edges, and angles. Cells are discriminating in their response, aroused by their own particular angle. The brain is no camera. It does not record pictures. Its aim is recognition. Identification. It looks for particular spatial and temporal correlations, using lines and patterns as the index card for its search for clarity. These spatial representations are temporal, dynamic, and continuously updated, definable solely as interesting correlations. All fleeting impressions are briefly recorded in new configurations. This framework creates a constantly changing internal environment. Only when one narrows in on specific areas of the visual field does its strangeness or the complex relations of one part of it to another become apparent. fixated gaze sets the world in motion. The visual field begins to oscillate and pivot around itself, resulting in a chromatic instability. There is a battle between planes amid a web of internal spatial geometries. When the internal becomes one with the environment, the self is lost. Locating self becomes a Riemannian equation. The position of the body is known not by what objects have been passed, but how long it has been in motion. The birth of the manifold, details become incessantly compelling. An angle, an edge, a movement captured in all dimensions. They come out of nothing and they disappear.
The next film, based in Swindon, home of Mike Allen, its creator. Swindon, the most average place in Britain, according to various surveys. It's always used as the test place for new kind of social ideas and experiments. Mike takes the notion that one day we will all live in our own TV world, where we continually make and appear in our own TV documentaries, and we will have to share our own subjectivities, that we will kind of only be us for 8 hours a day, and for the rest of the 16 hours a day it will be sort of two other people who share our identities. This is a kind of part plastic surgery clinic, part glimpse into this kind of shared world of a future of gout. Because of the kind of poor diets, we are all prone to gout in ways in which had been obviated from the 19th century.
Can I see your gout? Question mark. The skin's tight. And do you think that your disease is your own fault? Question mark. Patient turns away in irritation. Gout is microscopically beautiful. Stop. The crystalline formations pick up on the sharp nature of the arthritic condition. Full stop. I see the clinic as being visually sympathetic. Full stop. How did you start the design? Question mark. With the line of the pen, comma, a length of steel, comma, we began to weave. Do the cinematic elements benefit the patient? Question mark. The clinic allows us to swim in cinema. Full stop. It makes the pain of gout a little more bearable. Full stop. Spaces flow into one another, comma, we drift like cameras. Full stop.
singing.
Okay, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Follow up with all the presentations, a Q&A after the next presentation, which is from Squint Opera. And Alice, if you want to come up and start setting up the computer.
Yay. I think we're good. Just to introduce myself, I'm Alice, and I'm one of the founders of the company Squint Opera. And this is Sam Britton, who's been working with us since the early days. He writes a lot of the sound effects and music for the films that we produce. Briefly, Squint Opera is a multidisciplinary film and media company. We're based in Battersea in South London, and we're a collection of over 30 or 40 people, ranging from architects, or at least people who are architecturally trained, to 3D model makers, cartoon animators from the film industry, graphic designers, musicians, etc. We create imagery and films which often depict future scenarios. And we have a general interest in producing thought-provoking imagery. Last year we produced a series of images for an exhibition that we created entitled Flooded London, which got quite wide web coverage. In these 5 images, we imagine future scenarios set when the population of London has adapted to rising sea levels. So taking quite a disastrous future scenario, yet what we wanted to try and achieve with these images was to find a sense of kind of human optimism within there. So each of the 5 images were focused around a personal experience. This one is the kind of the lobster pot fishing. It's called Rich Pickings, and it's an image of St Mary Woolmoth Church from underwater, which is the Hawksmoor Church in Bank. This one was entitled Suburban Bucolia, which is an image in Honor Oak. What our future scenario of suburban London might look like, all overgrown, but people still finding the fun side of that and building their own inventions in their front gardens. This is called A Day in Town, A Spot of Fishing. This is Canary Wharf in a slightly different situation. But we were quite keen to get women fishing in there, for some unknown reason, really. And this is entitled Resurrection Experiment, in one of the back rooms of the Tate Gallery. This couple have taken over and started hoarding objects that they had from before the floods and turning them into something that would be useful in their present-day scenarios. And the final one is called A Late Afternoon Plunge in St Paul's Cathedral. Some lucky man has decided it's too hot on a day like today and has decided to use the church as the cathedral as a swimming pool. We often get asked how we make these images because they look like they're photo montages, they look like they're matte paintings. But actually it's a combination of many different technologies. There's more to these images that lies behind them than meets the eye. And this is just a short animation showing how these images are constructed. So the basis inspiration is a photograph, but then the entire space is created in a 3D environment. Moving on to another imagined scenario, a different project. This was a commission recently for this month's edition of Icon magazine, which depicts the city as having workable arable land, farmland. This would be a view from the Barbican looking across London in some future scenario.
So again, kind of in a similar sense, a lot of these images, like although they kind of look and feel like a photo montage, a lot of them are created, from scratch up. And I think there's an element within that of fiction that allows you to actually take a lot of, I guess, playfulness into that kind of idea, and to work kind of not only on the level of aesthetics, but to kind of plunge a bit further in and play about with the idea more kind of literally. I don't know. Yeah.
I guess one of the concepts is that it's almost like a world within an image, where we create even all the lighting and the new spaces. So it's almost like a stage set, the entire thing. Which moves us on to some of the work that we do in collaboration with architects and designers. This was something that we did as a sort of concept work at the ideas phase, along with Allsop Architects, for a project designing the future of Coney Island in New York. So these were very much these images were produced from a workshop in Coney Island. And I think what's interesting about these for us is that they're almost studies for a film. There's a lot beyond what's just in the image. There's another story to be told, I think. But we haven't taken them any further, which I think is quite a nice stage sometimes to leave projects at, just wondering what other scenarios could be within that image.
So I mean, obviously these last two are very much photo montages, but then there's a level at which these might evolve into a kind of storyboard, and you start to imagine a larger scale scenario in which all of these kind of imaginings then become a real world, or a real imagined world.
So this kind of moves us more into the direction of the majority of our work at the company, which is producing and being commissioned by architects and designers and developers to produce films and animations specifically for architectural proposals at various different stages of a project. For example, either like here at the very early sort of ideas and concept stage, or for a competition, perhaps for a public announcement once a design has been fully realized, or even something as banal as a planning application. This afternoon, rather than go through any sort of specific one or two films or projects in detail, we thought that we put together a collage of our work that we've produced over the last kind of 5 years or so. This isn't a show reel by any means. This is something that we edited together, which shows, I guess, the sort of science fiction-y side of what we do. And I don't really know exactly what that is, but I think you'll see that there's a lot of kind of connections between some of the themes that exist in science fiction and what we do, and whether that's a kind of just something that's built into us as filmmakers and as image makers, maybe, and also perhaps something that our clients desire and want us to express. So ranging from there's about 20 different projects that appear in this kind of montage, and it ranges from, well, the first clip is us. We conducted some vox pops on the streets of Yorkshire in 2002 about the urban renaissance of the northern cities, and it sort of goes through various other projects, including visualizing the future of the World Trade Center in New York. So some very different kind of ranging things. I suppose we were sort of considering that, that this is a kind of science fiction crib sheet. It's about 15 minutes long, and it's entitled How to Make the World in 6 Steps. And I hope you enjoy it.
We do need to change. We've got to change. I mean, if it stays where we're dead. Okay, I'm a science fiction fan. I believe in this sort of thing. But yeah, I believe it could work. If we're the first in the world, we could be somewhere special. We could be the place. Throwing everything out the window, I'd really like to see an archaeology. I'd like to see everything we need in the town centre in one building. I'd like to the wall round, a great idea. 10 stories high, 2 or 3 wide. Shops, apartments, restaurants. Everything we need in one go. I mean, Meadow's a great idea, but let's take it one step further. You know, let's really go for it.
Feed the sparrows too. It gives me a sense of enormous well-being.
Embrace chaos, crisis, and change.
Once there were towns that only had houses, so you spent half the day in the car. If home, sweet home, is not where your life is, wherever you go, it's too far. Okay, there were schools, but they weren't near the school kids, so the school run was always a pain. Come gather round, people, and hear what we're building, 'cause time's up for towns with no friends. Think forwards, think upwards, think how to turn it around. Think people, think places, think about building your town.
大家好，我现在所在的这个地方呢，就是无比城市的总控制中心，这里就是魔法发生的地方。我的天哪，看看这些复杂的控制器还有荧幕，让我们来请友善的车长先生尤林为我们解释一下这里是如何的操作运行。
UBCT 전체 길이 800km면 속도는 100입니다. 그리고 한 번 돌려면 8시간 걸리니까 하루 한 3번 움직이는 거죠. 그리고 우리 아주 좋은 시스템 가지고 있어서 기차 탔을 때 아니면 기차 연결시켰을 때 기차 자체는 멈출 필요 없습니다. 여러 가지 위치에서 연결시킬 수 있고 그 기차 내에서도 그런 시스템 다 있으니까 자기 원하는 부분만 기다리면 됩니다.
와우, 谢谢。
내
quite easy to forget that we're living in the future right now. And what I mean by that is we're living in someone else's future. There's an interesting story in New Scientist this week that's about, or maybe it was last week, but it talks about how if we want to learn how to adapt to rising sea change levels, then a good place to look is several, even tens of thousands of years in the past, when other, a much different branch of the human species, as it were, just because of historic age, had to confront rising sea levels. And in fact, sea levels rose much further in anthropological experience than they are going to in our experience. Even if Greenland melts, even if we get wholesale collapse of ice sheets, there was a gigantic sea level rise, 10, 15,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. And so we're living in the kind of a catastrophic time period right now. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because it's interesting that you can take sort of the justifiable sort of James Lovelock, we're all doomed and we're going to be living on the North Pole, breeding with 2 or 3 other people, and that'll be the future of the human species. Or you can take this kind of squint opera perspective, which is that, hey, we're going to have really awesome diving boards inside St. Paul's Cathedral, and that there's a kind of a whimsical, optimistic, let's have fun with this, even if it is radical climate change. So I guess, again, it just comes down to how we represent the future and to what extent we want to say that these are catastrophes coming down upon us, or if these are just, I'm embarrassed to admit it, I don't remember where I saw this in one of these presentations, but it said embrace chaos. Or maybe these are just chaotic situations that we need to embrace to find new opportunities. So again, I don't know, maybe it's just an attitudinal thing, but it seems that there's even within radical climate change, there are extremely exciting spatial and anthropological possibilities facing us.
Yeah. The Embrace Chaos was actually in one of the films, I think it was the Copenhagen film, trying to find design solutions for things. So yeah, it is, about just taking these scenarios and this kind of scientific event or whatever, and finding a kind of beauty in that, I suppose. And that's what we really enjoy doing at Squint anyway. It's just looking at images and finding out how they can tell different stories about different things. This kind of reminds me slightly of is it called Encounters at the End of the World, the Werner Herzog documentary, which I just saw last week, which kind of just examines this idea of people trying to find the solutions for things, trying to look at the science of things, but ultimately wondering if that's just completely futile. And I think there's something quite interesting in that, for me anyway.
One of the things that worries me most is the way in which school architectural education seems to be kowtowing to the profession, and there's a phrase that kind of has cropped up at the Bartlett a number of times about you want architectural practices want sort of students to come out oven ready, so they can already kind of just sit in the corner and just knock out the kind of schedules, knock out the kind of specifications, knock out the kind of detailing. And this is, absolutely, I would love Ian to come into schools of architecture and get architectural students writing those same kind of stories and actually beginning to kind of speculate and beginning to use the kind of imagination far more. Because it does seem that the kind of prescriptive nature of architectural education is such that these kinds of pressures, and I suppose a lot of that pressure also comes from sort of student debt, is killing the kind of imagination and killing the possibility of speculation. Most of my students, we do a two-year program, and they get all the kind of RIBA Part 2 stuff over in the 4th year. And it's quite a horrible experience where they have to crash out this kind of sort of fairly normative architecture or kind of conventional notion of a project. But the joy of that is that in 5th year, they can do what they like within some reason. But pretty much they've got kind of carte blanche. And I just wish that freedom was much more widely available across architecture education.
Just going back to the term chaos, I kind of quite liked that, that you picked up on this kind of term chaos, and kind of maybe 40 years ago, chaos would have been something that people feared. With a real, chaos was something bad. But since Feynman, since kind of the rational understanding of non-linear dynamics, chaos has become something that we see as actually quite beautiful. And I think that maybe within the science fiction community, or within this whole concept of science fiction, we also have to admit that ideas do change and move on in a certain way.
But isn't culture becoming more homogenized? It's becoming less chaotic.
Well,
it's becoming more standardized and more normative. I mean, even the way in which something like the sort of internet operates, which has a whole series of multiple possibilities, in a very, very short period of time, it becomes just a huge shopping mall. I mean, the kind of peripheral ways in which it's used to create new kind of connections are being subsumed by greater levels of advertising and kind of takeover. So this, I mean, how chaotic are these kind of systems?
Well, it depends where you look. Really.
I think also maybe it depends on, I mean, let's say, and this could be inaccurate, but let's say 96% of all culture always is going to be homogenous, and there's going to be 4% of culture that is radical, mutative, peripheral, and, you know, sort of fringe-seeking. But then the thing is that there's so many things happening now, and the population is so huge that that 4% is now bigger and bigger every year. So arguably, actually, if you can stick within, and these numbers are totally ridiculous, and I'm making them up, but if you stick within that 4%, now things are, you know, things are better now than they were an hour ago, because now that 4% just continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So one could argue.
If you put those figures on your blog, next year I'd see them in a student essay as truth. And that's kind of interesting.
I'll put them up on Twitter.
I mean, it kind of
why don't we see if there's a question from the audience, and then unfortunately we're going to have to wrap this up to continue with the rest of the day. But Matt, there's a microphone coming for you.
I'm Welsh, so I can just shout. I saw a really nice link between what Ian was saying about the rise of machine intelligence and the very last piece of the film of Squint Opera for a large forthcoming London-based sporting event.
No names.
Because it looked like the machines were having all the fun. And,
yeah.
and sort of in some of the films from the Bible and all the rest of it, there was this kind of these humans trapped in big machines and all the rest of it. And at the end, with the Squint Opera stuff, it was just really nice to see such jolly machines. And perhaps removing that kind of anthropocentric element from architectural education and discourse would be lead us to have more fun. Just wondering if you had any notions of what the rise of machine intelligence would mean to the sorts of things you're pursuing in these futures.
Well, these kind of notions of emergence, and isn't it sort of predicted 35 years that actually emergence will occur?
Move forward every 10 years.
I mean, we've already. I mean, that notion of sort of augmentation is already kind of happening. You know, we all carry around these sort of devices that sort of extend our ability to communicate over vast distances and all that kind of stuff. I mean, actually, I reckon even kind of machinic augmented intelligences will still sit around complaining because there's not enough stuff on TV or it's all repeats. You know, I do actually. I kind of think that a lot of stuff that's going to kind of really change, actually our perceptions of it might not change as much as we think they are. And again, I think it's that kind of why I'm so fascinated by Ballard and Ballard's writing is that he does locate so many of these kind of really massive transformations in this kind of the sort of banal details of the everyday. And actually, even though you may be kind of adrift in something that's completely cataclysmic, you're still kind of concerned over minutiae. And I think that's part of the nature of the human mind. And if we lose that, maybe that's what we lose when we lose our humanity.
It would be interesting, though, if in response to that, if you know how they keep trying to reboot new movie series, so now they're going to remake Alien to kind of like reboot the Alien series, and they tried to reboot Batman through whatever his name is, can't remember his name at the moment, Christopher Nolan. But if they tried to reboot Terminator, not through Terminator Salvation, but if maybe they find that once machine intelligence has come, they don't actually want to kill everybody, but they just want to have fun. You know, sort of the Pixar Happy Terminator, where you know, perhaps if you program into AI in any case that, you know, threat reduction, you have to reduce, like a robot looks to find ways not to damage itself. That becomes some kind of radical happy imperative.
Some kind of stroppy teenage Terminator who doesn't want to go out and kind of kill all the humans because I can't be bothered. So
There's
boring. So
wide,
boring killing everything.
A wide variety of possible Terminators. Well, why don't we end it with that, and we're going to move to the final two presentations of the afternoon. But let's give a big round of applause to our panelists.